The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
With the war in Ukraine, the ongoing civil war in Afghanistan, the civil war in Ethiopia, the drug war in Mexico, and civil war in Yemen, plus more than 17 other countries where terrorist insurgencies regularly erupt in gunfire, bombings, and death, is the world becoming more violent? According to the Global Peace Index, yes. Over the past 14 years, peacefulness has fallen, with the average country score deteriorating by 3.2%. According to the GPI, Canada and North America have seen significant changes. Steve Killelea, the CEO of the Institute of Economics and Peace, says Canada went from the world's 8th most peaceful country in 2021 to 12th in 2022. This is the first substantial deterioration in peacefulness in that country in more than a decade. And North America recorded the second largest deterioration of any region in 2022. The level of peacefulness in the U.S. is now lower than at any time since 2008, with civil unrest being the primary driver of the deterioration. I invited Steve Killelea, the CEO of the Institute of Economics and Peace, to join me for a conversation that matters about the troubling trend, its economic impacts, and how to reverse it. Steve, welcome.
Well, it's great to be on the show. Thank you for inviting me.
Why is it so important that we continue to monitor the level of peacefulness around the world? What are the major impacts when we see a deterioration?
So the reason we need to monitor peace and be able to measure it, it gives us an idea of the changing environment around us. Similarly, if we've got a measure of peace, particularly in the case of the Global Peace Index, a global measure, means we can then use other forms of analysis like mathematical modelling or statistical analysis then to understand the factors which are associated with highly peaceful societies. And similarly, if you've got the trends, you can do it by regions. So now you can understand the changes in regions over time. It also gives you the ability to be able to do it by different domains. So if we look at the Global Peace Index, it's broken up into 3 different domains: internal safety and security, ongoing conflict, and levels of militarization. So you can also look at by those different dimensions, and the whole thing comes together with 23 different indicators which actually create the global state of peace. And as you've mentioned, now if we look back, it's deteriorated 3% since the inception of the Global Peace Index. That's the lowest it's ever been. And what we can see is that 11 of the last 14 years, it's actually deteriorated. So it's concerning. And a lot of it, the big deteriorations, have actually happened since 2014.
How important is it that we focus on the fact that people, the impact is on people, their individually, their families, their communities?
Yes, I think this is the sad thing. Quite often the individuals get lost in the stats. And that's one of the things with an index. Like when you produce the index, how do you actually bring it back and bring it back so it's related to the people who suffer? And quite often the people who are suffering are those which quite often can be furthest from the war. And so I think what you can see with, let's say, the Ukraine war, and we're seeing the increases in food prices, but that has the most severe effects in some of the most remote places of the world, like the poorest parts of Africa. So as we're looking there now, the number of people facing starvation at the moment has now jumped to 49 million people. That's an increase of 25% in the last 6 months. And similarly, the number of people who are severely food insecure has jumped to 1.1 billion, and that's up 40% compared to 6 months ago. And the really sad part is those figures are only going to get higher in the next 6 to 12 months as the full impact of the supply constraints around the Ukraine really set in.
How important is the Russia-Ukraine war right now in bringing down the overall index? Or is it, because as far as I can see, it is the only country-to-country conflict that is going on at the moment, but it seems to be having dramatic impacts.
Yes, well, this is it. So you've got the immediate impacts today, but you've also got the impacts which will surface over the next couple of years. So now the war started on the 23rd of February, and the index cuts off with its stats on the 31st of March. So a lot of what's happened between between the 31st of March and now hasn't been taken into account. But having said that, what we've got is the Ukraine has had the largest drop in global peacefulness this year. And now, if we're looking at Russia, Russia is now the fourth least peaceful country in the world, and it's had one of the largest drops in peacefulness as well. And so it also spills over and affects other indicators, such as relations with neighbouring states. So we can find a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe who border Russia have fallen. So they'd be countries like Sweden, Finland, Lithuania, just to name some.
So when we see Sweden and Finland, for instance, all of a sudden step up and say we want to be considered for inclusion into NATO, does that affect the Global Peace Index, or is it a kind of an ancillary or sidebar issue?
We'd see it as a sidebar issue, I guess. Not great terminology, but let's use it anyway. So we'd see it as something on the side. Now, what will happen with the ascension into NATO, and they may increase their military expenditure. Increases in military expenditure then account towards the Global Peace Index. So the definition used to create the Global Peace Index is the absence of violence or fear of violence. And so if we have a military, generally we've got them for two reasons. One is because we fear our neighbours, which is what we're seeing with Finland and Sweden and other Eastern European countries' reactions, or you want to do something to assert some sort of geopolitical dominance. So either ways, that's why it counts as a negative. Now, if we're looking at NATO, and the members of NATO made commitments to meet the 2% of GDP targets which NATO set, then that would increase their expenditure on the military by about 7%. And that then would flow through as being a negative on the index. But just joining NATO itself, that doesn't actually have an effect on the scores which we cover, which you can bring down to the absence of violence or fear of violence.
I got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Well, I noted in your report that Europe is one of the most stable regions and considered to be one of the most peaceful overall regions. Is that changing now that we're seeing the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
So, well, if we look at it, and remember the cut-off period was for the 31st of December, with a number of the figures being up to the 31st of December of 2021, we can find that overall peace in Europe increased slightly. Now, I think the bigger question is how will that look going forward? So there's a whole lot of background conditions which we can see at the moment which are disturbing. So there's a series of indicators now which underlie the drop in peacefulness, which now are at their worst state since the inception of the Global Peace Index. And sort of one of them is state-sponsored terror, that's extrajudicial killings, torture, imprisonment without trial. Relationships with neighbouring states, political instability, there'd be some of the indicators which we can, and number of the IDPs and refugees, they're at record levels as well. And so all those indicators now have got a whole lot of background conditions which are not probably going to make them improve. So as we're sitting here today, we've got inflation rates, the highest they've been in 40 years, and there's no sign that those inflation rates are going to go down in the near future. We've got the Malay in the economy, so economic conditions aren't looking good. So the IMF has downgraded all growth prospects, and so there'll be a number of economies which will probably go into recession. We've got record levels of debt with rising inflation. We've got supply chain issues which are going to stretch forward for at least another 12 months to come. And then obviously we've got rising food prices and energy prices which really affect just the average person not only in Europe, but globally as well, and including the US and Canada.
The economic impact of unrest and violence is tremendous. Nowhere more so, I think, than we see in the Middle East, which, as you have pointed out, is home to some of the most violent areas in the world, Afghanistan being one example. What can we do, because these are internal conflicts for the most part, what can the rest of us do to have some kind of influence to try and move the needle back in the other direction?
Well, this is very, very difficult to answer. Let's face it, if we look at it recently, Western alliances have been involved in Afghanistan, Iraq. It's probably spent about $7 trillion, both on the military side of it and on the aid side of it after, with what little effect in the long run. So I think there's a need for us to really rethink the way we do aid. Now, one of the things which we do know, there's a whole series of factors which create for highly peaceful societies, and they create the resilience. So it's very difficult for those societies then to lapse into violence. And that's a concept called positive peace. But these same factors which create for a highly peaceful society also create a whole lot of other things we think are important, like higher per capita GDP growth rates. So you find they perform better on measures of ecological sustainability, better on measures of well-being, happiness, and also better on measures of development. And so these factors change slowly over long periods of time. But we as a society need to start to focus on the long-term factors which create for sustainable peace and stronger economic development, because it all goes together, it all comes together. And so none of this is simple. But I think simply in the short term, the thing which we've all got to realise, that wars in the modern era is crazy. Not even with all the might of the Western powers were we able to in Afghanistan, nor really in Iraq. And so we're seeing the same thing happen now in the Ukraine. And so from an economic perspective, wars now are just simply crazy. And I think that's one of the lessons, hopefully, other countries will take away from watching what's happening in Ukraine currently.
When I was looking at your report, I was actually a bit taken back to see that Ireland is in the top 3 most peaceful countries, because I can think back 20 some odd years ago, and there's no way that you would say that Ireland was peaceful. What can we learn from that model?
Well, I think there's a lot which, so Ireland had a whole range of things happen. One, it got the accession into the EU. With that accession, then you had a whole lot of privileges which Ireland had, which then improved its economic growth rates quite substantially. And so societies where, let's face it, the tide is rising and all boats are rising, make for a happy rowers, let's say, for want of a better analogy. Similarly, you've also got the Good Friday Agreement, which occurred in Northern Ireland at the same time. And so those two things combined together really helped. And I think one of the things we can see with the Northern Ireland Agreement, you had the US government came in solidly behind trying to help create the conditions for those negotiations. And so a lot of that cut off the supplies to the IRA. So quite often when you've got the military, if you can cut the money supply off, then it's a lot harder for them to exist and a lot more likely to bring them to the negotiating table. Then along with that, what you can see in Ireland, separate from Northern Ireland, you saw the rising economic conditions, which then go a long way to sort of getting rid of the drivers, let's say, of a whole range of different crimes.
This is our second break. We'll be back in a moment.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
How would you characterize the current situation between Palestine and Israel? Are we seeing a slow ebbing of the tensions and violence there, or are we still a long way off from being able to find a solution that will bring greater peacefulness to those two countries or regions?
Well, Palestine had quite a significant drop in peace in this year's edition of the Global Peace Index. I think, like many ways, well, there's conflict. It's not as bad as what it used to be, but from where we're sitting, we can't see any near-term solutions to the standoff between Israel and Palestine.
Do we have to be careful, though, not to throw our hands in the air and say, well, we can't do anything about it? Because if you take a look at Lebanon, it is a much more peaceful region now than it was 20, 30 years ago. And this took time to get to this point, but we have seen improvements there.
Well, I think in many ways with Israel, the US is the major negotiator there. And so obviously whatever tack the US takes will have a lot of effects on whether the peace negotiations between Israel and Palestine. But Lebanon's an interesting case because if you look at it today, it's got a lot of economic issues. They've had trouble actually forming government over the last couple of years. Yet, and Hezbollah has been controlling the government, but it's even so, it's still not breaking out into civil war, which, as you quite rightly pointed out, existed some time ago. Quite often you can get with a situation where countries fight and everyone gets to a point where no one's winning and thinking, well, this is enough. There must be another way of moving forward. And in that case, then, you quite often get negotiations and alliances amongst foes. And even though they can be quite fractured alliances and there can be a lot of internal fighting, it's not violent. So examples of that, let's say if you look at FARC in Colombia and the recent peace negotiations which are done there, you have to say they've moved far from being smooth, but it's certainly gone a long way to decreasing the violence in Colombia.
So many of these regions, I mean, they're between governments or a lot of it is internal civil war, terrorism, and so on. But when we look at Mexico, it's the drug wars that really have a significant impact on their level of peacefulness, and it really is causing extraordinary challenges for that country.
Yes, no, this is true. And I think what's shocking is 6 of the 10 cities in the world with the highest homicide rates actually lie in Mexico. And now, if you're looking at the homicide rates, they're slightly improved in the last 2 years, but they're just very, very marginal improvements. So overall, the homicide rates have increased dramatically over the last 6 years. And certainly, when you look within the country, you've got the cartels have got a significant influence in all sorts of the parts of the running of the country, and particularly when you get down to some of the towns. So, for example, I think it was something like 120 people got assassinated in the last elections for people who were standing for office. It's also violent places in the world to be a journalist. There's something like 16 people were executed just for being journalists in the last years, and generally they were doing research on corruption or gang-related violence.
We can't negate the impact of COVID-19 globally, but in my introduction, I talked about this deterioration in peacefulness in North America. Was COVID-19 a factor in that deterioration?
Well, yes, I think the bottom answer to that is, so what we found is when COVID started, a number of indicators actually improved, like levels of violent crime, homicide rates, and such. We did find other levels of violence, like domestic violence, did increase. But so people came out of lockdowns, then things started to change. So for Canada, for example, you had a lot of demonstrations there, as was in many countries around the world over lockdown conditions. A lot of people just didn't like the impositions of being locked down. So that fueled sort of violent demonstrations. And so if we look in the situation of Canada, for example, and we look over the last 12 months, what we can find is there are a number of things which have sort of caused the 4th place drop for Canada to 12th place. First, there's an increase in the homicide rates, admittedly mildly, but there was an increase in that. What we also found is the perceptions of criminality also increased within Canada. The thing which caused a large part of the drop was the increase in violent demonstrations. And now that's a trend which we can see going on globally. So if we go back and see the last 14 years, what we find is the indicator with the largest deterioration was violent demonstrations. In fact, it deteriorated by 49%. So we look globally, something like 120 odd countries actually deteriorated in violent demonstrations, while roughly about 20 odd countries actually improved.
Third and final break. We'll be right back.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Okay, let's end on a positive note. Tell me why Denmark and Iceland are so peaceful.
Well, there's a standard joke about Iceland. Well, you know why it's so peaceful. It's so cold, no one goes outside. But since it's become number one on the index, I've certainly travelled there quite a bit. And when you look at the history, it goes back almost 1,000 years. And so the country is massively inhospitable. So what's happened over that period of time, people have needed to come together to actually sort of work to be able to overcome the conditions. And so it's been, I think it's been almost 800 years since they've had any internal conflict in Iceland. In fact, after about 20 or 30 years ago, if you're out and you came to someone's house, you're quite free to walk in if they weren't there, put a kettle on the stove and make yourself a cup of tea. And that's because the conditions were so inhospitable, and obviously it took ages to travel anywhere, that you could easily get caught out in the cold and you'd come in. So it's this bonding through the community over many, many years, which has created a high level of tolerance, which seems to have carried through today. At least that's my impressions when I've looked at the history of the country. I've been quite surprised.
I think you're absolutely right. I think about driving in the far north in Canada. You're driving down the road, you don't see another car coming in any direction for more than an hour and a half. The rule of the road there is if you see somebody stopped, you stop and ask them if they need help, because if they become abandoned there, they could easily die. And there is this appreciation, I guess, that we need one another to survive. And even though we, for the most part, the rest of the world lives in, tight quarters, we still need each other to survive and thrive. And I think that is probably the most important message, that we find ways to support one another, and hopefully both parties are benefiting.
Yeah, now look, I can't agree with you more. And we're all human beings, and in the end, we relate to other human beings. And I think for all of us, in terms of our own sense of self-worth, it's our relationships which count. I quite often get asked, how do you create peace at an individual level? And so I think what's really important in those kind of situations is that you go, hello, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Gone.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry, thought you'd gone. So quite often you get asked about peace at an individual level. And I think you're quite right. What we need to do is, it's just simple things like when you go and, let's say, get a cup of coffee, it's the smile and be friendly at the person behind the counter. It's with your family when they say something which a kid's upset you, or your wife is complaining about something, or your husband, then just take a little bit of time before answering. Just try and understand a little bit from the other person's perspective. Doesn't mean you're not going to think any differently or respond any differently, but you will respond in a way which is probably a lot more understanding, a lot more peaceful. And so quite often it's just those little human interactions in life which have a rebounding effect. The Dalai Lama once said, look, if you think the little things didn't matter, then try sleeping in a room with a mosquito.
So aptly put. A wonderful way to end this conversation. Thank you very much for your time today.
Okay. Thank you. It's great being on the show.
Yes, thank you. I love how well you know your topic.